Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this live chit chat with myself, Carla McNeil, and David Kilpatrick. David, it is an absolute privilege to be streaming you in to New Zealand shores. Welcome.
Thank you.
So it's been really nice to connect with you again this morning. I was just reminding David, everybody, that we had met as he meets many avid fans, which he's a very humble man, and wasn't so keen for me to be a fangirl. But we did meet in Sydney in August in 2019, which was a huge privilege. And that was when we discovered you'd actually had a trip across the ditch to Hamilton. And we're going to hopefully have you back here sometime very soon. But let's get on and introduce you to our listeners this morning and hear a little bit more about all of your fantastic work. So David is a professor of psychology for the State University of New York College at Cortland, and he teaches courses in learning disabilities and educational psychology. He is also a New York State certified school psychologist and has done over 1,000 evaluations of students with reading difficulties during his 27 years with the East, now help me if I pronounce this wrong, David, with the East Syracuse Manoa Central School District. How'd I go?
That's good.
Thanks. David currently conducts research on reading difficulties and does professional development workshops for educators. Most of you will know his work as he authors The Essentials of Assessing, Preventing and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, and also now this text, which is now on New Zealand shores, Equipped for Reading Success. Welcome, David. Again, it is an absolute privilege to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things that I thought it would be great for us to begin chatting about this morning is in your text, Equipped for Reading Success, what would you say are the key messages that you really hoped readers would take away from that text?
Well, I think that whole point is that most of us have an intuition. I certainly did my first several years working as a school psychologist and doing evaluations. So yeah, I've done over 1,000 evaluations of kids with reading problems. Probably the first 400, I didn't know what I was doing, okay? And we have this strong intuition that we remember words based on some sort of visual memory process. And that's just based on intuition because the words go in through our eyes. We assume that the memory is visual, and it's not, it turns out. And so really the whole point of that book is to help train, which we'll talk a little bit more later about, but train the phonological skills that are necessary for word reading. And for so many children, those skills develop fairly naturally just by introducing them to an alphabetic-based writing system. But for a substantial portion of children, that does not fall into place very well on its own.
Mm. So that's a really great segue in terms of what the research has actually taught us about how the brain learns to read. What do you experience, before we go into that, what do you experience in your region or across the states that you support in terms of bridging the gap between the science and the research of how the brain does learn to read and what is actually happening on the floor in classrooms?
Yeah, it's hard to say. We're making some inroads to get people to apply some of this. I think it's probably not much different in New Zealand than in the States, but for almost 4 decades, we've had an approach to teaching reading that completely, without any malintent, of course, but steers children away from some of the most foundational elements that are necessary for reading. So we now know that reading has at least word reading. This is, of course, we know reading, the goal of reading is comprehension, but you're not going to comprehend what you can't read off the page. So we have the word reading skill, and we can distinguish that from the comprehension because you have children that can read the words just fine and they don't comprehend what they're reading. And then you have children who could comprehend if you read it to them, but they can't comprehend what they read because they can't read the words very well. And so, and that's why I cover the simple view of reading that's been around for a number of decades. And so anyway, if there are two levels of word reading that we have to pay attention to. One is the ability to efficiently sound out a new, or work out, as you might say, a new unfamiliar word by looking at the grapheme phoneme correspondences and then coming up with a good phonetic approximation and go, oh, that's such and such a word. So that's one skill that all skilled readers have. And we know that even if they were never taught phonics skills, we know all skilled readers of alphabetic writing systems have phonics skills. And we know that because they can read nonsense words. And if there was some other way that they were reading, there's no way they could read nonsense words. If it was visual memory, because they've never seen it before, they have no visual memory to go back on. So that's one essential skill. And the second essential skill is remembering words. When we read, we don't sound out words over and over and over, the same words. We remember words. And so it turns out phonemic skills, phonemes, of course, the smallest unit that help us distinguish one syllable from the next. And by the way, anything I say today, I have to apologize in advance for my upstate New York American accent, okay? So, especially when it comes to vowels. But so the difference between had and hat is just a phoneme, right? Hat and you know, hit, the difference is a phoneme. So that's a phoneme. And being able to notice and perceive those phonemes turns out to be essential for reading any alphabetic writing system. The interesting thing is we call English and Spanish and French and German, we call them alphabetic writing systems, but that's not a particularly useful title. That name of that type of writing system comes from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. That's where we get alphabet. So really a more useful expression would be to point out that those types of writing systems are phoneme-based writing systems. They're phoneme writing systems. And so we don't really write words in English or Spanish or any other language. We write phoneme characters. Now in Chinese, they write a word when they use their characters, but we don't write words. We write phoneme characters, we string them together, and we say that constitutes a written word. So if you have difficult access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language, you're going to struggle in reading. So that's really why we need to train those skills. And it turns out those phonemes are important, not just for sounding out words, but also for remembering words, which is totally not intuitive, but it turns out to be the correct.
I've really hooked onto what you've talked about with the phoneme writing system and in relation to, you know, the transformational shift in practice from where teachers are implementing a balanced literacy or a predominantly whole language reading approach, or the teaching of spelling, reading and writing. When you explain it like that, when you explain it in the clear way that you did about it being a phoneme writing system, it makes it so obvious that we do need to be focusing on those foundation elements, such as phonological and phonemic awareness, and then ensuring we are teaching and helping students to map phoneme to grapheme correspondences. That's a great segue, David, for us to then go into an elaboration of why phonemic awareness is crucial as a foundation skill.
Well, part of the problem is our vocabulary. Sometimes certain words get used early on in the discovery of something, and then we get stuck with that. One example is, you know, you mentioned earlier about how the brain reads. And neuroscientists back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they saw that in what's called the left fusiform gyrus, they saw that activation in that area when we see words that we're familiar with. And unfortunately, they called it the visual word form area. When you get the word visual and you get the word form, you think it's a visual memory. And so it's not a good name for it. Well, in a similar way, phonological awareness is a bit confusing because we have two different things that come under that same broad heading. One is what we would call phonological or phonemic synthesis. That's putting things together. And the most common form of synthesis would be a blending task. And as it turns out, the blending skill is necessary for sounding out an unfamiliar word or working out an unfamiliar word phonetically. But then there's a whole different type of quote unquote phonological awareness, which to me is really truly phonological awareness. I'm not clear if I think long and hard about blending, how that has anything to do with awareness. That has more to do with activation. So if I look at a word and I go sat, I don't know where awareness fits in to that. I don't know why that's called awareness. That's activation. So it activates the word sat. But when you talk about phoneme awareness analysis is when you have to pull it apart. So now the word awareness makes sense because you say, are you aware of the phonemes that make up the word sat? Oh, I hear a t at the end, I hear an a in the middle. So to me, anyway, nobody's paying attention. No one asked me, so we're stuck with this. So really there's two different phonemic level skills that are essential. One for each of those two levels of word reading. The first level is being able to phonetically determine an unfamiliar word, and the second is remembering words. And the phoneme blending is important for the first, and the phoneme analysis is important for the second. And they're not optional. If they were optional, we would not have a long-standing problem, which is, I'm really surprised at how many people are not aware of this in education, but everybody involved in deaf education is aware of it. But individuals who are deaf, they do not have good access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language, and learning to read is a serious long-standing problem for individuals who are deaf. So it's about the phoneme. It's about connecting phonemes to graphemes.
I just love what you've said about the awareness and the activation. Like for me, personally and professionally, you've turned a light bulb on that hadn't been turned on. And I think when we're working with students who struggle, I'm hoping that many of us listening will be thinking about, are they aware, and then are they able to activate, and then is that potentially two different things? Or because some students that we all work with are really struggling, and so we need to be continuously increasing our knowledge, don't we, and reflecting on what's happening with those students and asking ourselves what is going on in the brain of that reader, and how do we best support them. And that's where your book is wonderful, because you have so many exercises in the back of your book to support that. Can we just take a step back? If you were to, in a nutshell, say what you would really hope that research has taught educators about how the brain learns to read, how would you summarize that?
I think,
no pressure,
it might sound repetitive to what I said earlier, but I think recognizing that we have a phonemic-based writing system, and we have to attend to that. What's interesting is we can distinguish between 4 different ways of approaching reading instruction, and they can be distinguished pretty easily between them based upon the unit that you're focusing on with your instruction. And they fall along a continuum. So on the one end of the continuum, you have where you're focusing on letters and sounds, and that would be your classic phonic approach. Then you start moving down the continuum, and now you're not talking just about individual letters and sounds, you're talking about chunks of words, and that would be your classic linguistic word family approach. Then you go the next step down the continuum, now you're talking about whole words. So that philosophy of teaching reading dominated reading from the early 1800s right up until the whole language became popular. And the reasoning was that, hey, when we read as adults, we just look at a word and we say it. So why are we having kids break it down? That's just not a good use of our time. And so then you have the fourth, which notice how you're going from individual letters and sounds to groups of letters and sounds, but not the whole word. Then the whole word is the third level. And then sentences and paragraphs. So that's the next unit, which balanced literacy, whole literacy, makes a lot of use of context to try to determine words. So what's really interesting is we do have numerous studies down through the decades, right up until today, where you are comparing one or the other of these. And I even know of a few studies that compare 3 different ones. I don't know of any study that compares all 4 in the same study, but by comparing many of them, different versions of them, you can really rank order them in terms of how effective they are, both in terms of general educational type teaching for all children, as well as remedial education. And what's fascinating, regardless of whether it's helping struggling readers or just the general population, the effectiveness falls along that exact same continuum. the closer you get to the nature of our writing system, the phonemic nature of the writing system, the better results you get. The farther you get from that, the worse results you get. So that is part of what the research community has been discovering, and people need to acknowledge this, as opposed to, well, this is how we've been doing it and I like it. And or the other thing we find is people seem to be critical of an approach that they didn't get trained on or not as familiar with, and they say things. There's a certain type of logical fallacy called special pleading, and special pleading is basically when you use an argument that you yourself would not accept in any other context. And one of them is, phonics is boring. It's like, have you ever looked at the beginning readers within balanced literacy or word, the word whole word approach or the word family approach? All of them, are pretty inane stuff. So it's really a matter of how you present it. It has nothing to do. There's nothing inherently more or less boring in any of the approaches. It's all about how you present it.
Absolutely. Let's go now to your. I want to pick up more on your 4 steps, going from letters and sounds to word families to whole words to sentences and paragraphs. When you speak that, I am imagining that back left lobe and thinking about how the progression of how those things are stored. I think this is a really good segue for us to head into discussing the process of orthographic mapping. So let's go there, but can you begin that by, in relative plain terms, explaining what actually is orthographic mapping first?
Yeah. It's an abstract concept. Most people first time through don't get it. But it's funny because even with my undergraduate students, mostly juniors and seniors, and occasionally when I'm presenting for teachers, you're looking out across the people and you're explaining this, and all of a sudden you see a face light up. It's like, oh, now I get it. Okay. Yeah. And that's pretty exciting. But basically the idea is that from infancy onward, one way that we remember, a central way that we remember things, is to connect something new to something we already have stored. And at its most basic level, that's what orthographic mapping is doing. What do we already have stored? The pronunciation. So we have the word's pronunciation already stored, and we're going to use that bit of information in our long-term memory to try to remember something new. And what is the something new? That specific order of letters. And I think what happens, believe it or not, I find, and this is nothing negative, this is just an observation, and I think a reality, I find that my undergraduate students who don't know anything about reading can understand orthographic mapping much better than a reading teacher. Why? Because a reading teacher already has, when you start talking about letters, sounds, and all these things, already has certain ideas about how that fits together, and we have this natural default to like phonetic decoding or working out the word. You're going in a completely different direction. So I think that creates interference. And I think it did for me, because when I first read about Airy's theory of orthographic mapping, I thought she was advocating the idea that somehow we're sounding out words super fast and we become super automatic at sounding out words. And that's not what she's saying. So the little bit I knew about phonics was interfering with my ability to understand the orthographic mapping process. So the idea is that I have something in my long-term memory and I want to connect what I'm trying to learn to that. So if I can pull apart, like if my hand represents a spoken word, like this is my hand, and we'll use the word hand, okay? So if hand is a singular syllable in a singular word, and someone says the word hand, and this represents the phonological representation. So someone says hand, and I know what a hand is. And then I see the printed word hand, H-A-N-D. Well, how am I going to remember this? If in my long-term memory, I can pull apart the individual sounds that I'm hearing, I now have connecting points to store this sequence of letters. It's not about sounding it out. One of the most important things to remember is you can't do orthographic mapping unless you already know what the word is that you're looking at. So that's one of the main differences between that and some sort of phonetic decoding. With phonetic decoding, I don't know what the word is, and I'm trying to track through and sound. But orthographic mapping, once you know what it is, you're able to connect the sounds in your long-term memory to that sequence and make it familiar. But if I don't have access to pull that apart, I can get hand as a unit, but I can't go below the syllable down to the level of the individual phonemes. I don't have a mechanism for remembering that.
So can we take that a step further then, and you give us a little bit of a chat around the semantic lexicon, the phonological lexicon, and the orthographic lexicon, and how that then kind of rolls into an elaboration of what you've just talked about potentially?
Sure. So we have a phonological lexicon, and that's developing from birth onwards. And so in the phonological lexicon, we have things like whole words, like the word hand. But we also have parts of words, believe it or not. For example, my favorite rhyme unit is ip. Now, right away, if you were listening carefully, you say, this guy's very strange. He has a favorite rhyme unit. Okay. Well, the reason I say that is because there are 20 single syllable words in English that have ip in it. That's why I think it's probably the most populous. And just to show you what a boring guy I am, I did not read that anywhere. Okay. Well, anyway,
can I just say, I have a colleague who I know is watching this who will just be absolutely super excited by this little piece of knowledge that you've shared, and she will be going off to explore.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the point is, ip is not a word. However, ip is in our phonological lexicon because it is embedded within dip and sip and ship and a whole bunch of other words. We know that from very specific studies, especially in the 90s. You know what's interesting? People don't realize this that are not that familiar with research, but researchers will study a phenomenon for a certain amount of time, and if enough studies point in the same direction, and there are not too many lingering questions, they move on to other things, and this is one of them. So we have a lot of research to show that in the same way that we remember words as whole words, we remember parts of words as chunks through that same process. So we have whole words in our phonological lexicon, we have parts of words, and then we also have words that we don't even know what they mean. Children have that. They hear adults use words, but they don't know what they mean yet. Individuals where English is not their first language yet, they're learning English, same thing. And so those, but it's something that, oh yes, I've heard that word. Immediately recognize I've heard that word before. So those are all part of the phonological lexicon in our long-term memory. And then we have our semantic long-term memory, and that involves our knowledge of either full or partial meaning. And of course, English is so interesting compared to other languages. We have so many synonyms, we have so many homophones, homographs, etc. There's a lot to keep track of, and sometimes we don't even recognize how hard it is and the challenge for individuals who are learning English later on. So that has to do with the meanings, and so that is our semantic lexicon. And then we have our orthographic lexicon, and that is all the words that are familiar to us immediately when we see them. But there are all kinds of divergences. So you see a word like right, R-I-G-H-T, but you see W-R-I-T-E, and those have different entries into the orthographic lexicon. They have different entries in the semantic lexicon, but they have the same entry in the phonological lexicon. At least they do here in the States. But so we have to understand the relationship between the three of them, and we want all of them to be strong, really. And to neglect any of them, I think, is not helping the child.
Yeah, great explanation. Thank you. So where I want to go now is probably into, or just before I go to what we'll chat about next, we've got a few comments on our comment thread, and I'd just like to invite people, if you do have a question that you would like me to ask for you, please jump into the comment thread now, and I will do my best to fit that in. I know that you're on a very tight time frame, David. You're actually teaching, hence you've got that fancy tie on today. So let's just go now then. I've got two more questions for you from me, and then I'll check in with others. I'd like to sort of wrap up with you potentially sharing, what would 3 tips be that you pass on to classroom teachers in a bid to ensure that they are not leaving the development of the reading brain to chance?
Yeah, 3 tips. Well, one is to get them to help children notice the sound structure of the spoken language, because that's going to be the basis for remembering words. A second one would be to develop not only that skill to the point where it's automatic, but also their letter sound knowledge should be automatic. So if you show even a child who's never been taught phonics in any systematic way, if they're a good reader and they're a 4th grader, you show them, MIP, and they'll say MIP instantly. They don't say MIPE, but had you shown them MIPE, they'd have said MIPE. And they may not explain why they said MIP and not MIPE. They might not even know why. So what's happened is they've automatized through what we call statistical learning. They've automatized that process of the letter sound learning. So developing the sounds within the spoken language, developing the automaticity. And then the third is that we do reading comprehension, vocabulary development, background knowledge from the moment children walk into kindergarten till they leave 12th grade on the bus that last day. That permeates our day. It's not like, okay, here's our reading comprehension time. I think that is really a problem. Children become very good word readers. Children develop language skills. We give them many opportunities to integrate the two of them. But that is the most important thing for success in school, is to develop the vocabulary knowledge, background knowledge, etc. But if we don't develop the word reading, then we are making it harder for them to develop the vocabulary and the background knowledge, because they're not going to read on their own. And that's where a lot of our vocabulary and background knowledge comes from. So those would be the 3 things: automaticity with phonemes, letter sounds, and our development of language.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm just going to throw in one other element there on when I want to pick up a little bit on the word level reading, and just give you a minute to potentially elaborate on the importance of us understanding the significance of word level reading, and maybe why that is so important.
Well, you won't be able to get at the meaning if you can't read the words. One illustration, I don't ever do it in any presentations for teachers, but I do it in my class, is I will take some English words and I will put them on the screen in either Greek characters, Hebrew characters, or Russian, Cyrillic type characters. And I say, can anybody tell me what these are? And of course they can't. I'm like, these are English words, right? So if you can't read the words off the page, then you're not going to be able to understand. So that's foundational. And anytime we sort of brush that aside as just sort of, as actually one of the founders of the modern version of whole language, Ken Goodman, he says that the actual word reading is just incidental and a byproduct of learning to read, whatever that possibly could mean. I don't know how you bootstrap yourself to understand if you can't read the words.
And I think what we're observing internationally now is a real hinging to what the research and what the science is telling us about the process the brain goes through when it is learning to read. And I think that helps us to debunk those types of ideological statements that have historically led our teaching practice. There's a great question here that I'd like to ask on behalf of a parent. The parent saying, I've heard conflicting information about teaching children to read nonsense or pseudo words. What is your stance on using those?
Well, one of the things, both in research, but also teachers or educational evaluators, or the value of nonsense words is to let you know if the child is proficient with the code, because they can't rely on past experience with any of those words because they're not real words. But there seems to be this negative attitude about using nonsense words as if they're not authentic, but they are authentic in a few ways. Number one, every new real word that a child encounters for the first time is functionally a nonsense word until they have sounded it out. Secondly, most of these syllables in multisyllabic words themselves are nonsense syllables. So even like remember, a word like remember, burr is not a word. I mean, there is a word burr, you pick off yourself going through the forest, but it's a different spelling. So it's not, there's no word BER. and there's no word mem, M-E-M, and there's no word re. So there you go, 3 nonsense words, all right? And so it's a good index of that, but it's almost as if people criticize it like somewhere somebody is saying to the kids, okay, let's sit down and do our 20 minutes of nonsense word paragraph reading. You know, I don't know. I've never had a thorough understanding of why people have it. And nobody's suggesting you have kids read lots of them, but it's really good for assessment. And you can use it a little bit here and there in terms of spelling or in terms of reading, but obviously you want them to read real words.
Yeah.
Primarily, right?
Yeah, and also perhaps it stems back to what is your purpose for using them, and also that your understanding of that again, you know, why are you doing this, and what is it that you're actually working through? Sure. My mind went back to that 4-step process you took us through when you took us back to letters and sounds, and then to word families, and then to whole words. And as you were speaking, I was just saying to myself, well, it's obvious what you're doing is using those to reinforce those first 2 steps of that process. Okay, so 3 tips for parents who have children who are struggling to become readers.
I would say the same thing when they read with their kids. Get them to understand, you know, they're always comprehension. Like I said, that needs to permeate every lesson. And the funny thing is, regardless of the approach you take, if it's the word family, you're going to come across words they've never heard before, right? And that's your teachable moment for that. So every approach has that, no matter what it's designed. So we should always be doing teachable moments for vocabulary and background knowledge. But at the same time, parents should hold children read, they should hold them accountable that they read the right word and not guess and not jump ahead. Because kids who struggle, they will try to avoid the work of sounding it out because they're not good at that, and of the phonetic decoding. And so we need to hold them accountable to do that. The natural way that struggling readers work are the strategies that are taught in balanced literacy. And so for most children, they quickly abandon that because they realize it's not as efficient as sounding it out and remembering the word. But for children that struggle, who aren't good at sounding it out and remembering the words, they don't have any other choice left. And so that's the natural tendency. And so you want parents to hold them accountable, try to track through the word the best they can, and even do a little wordplay with them. And there are lots of things free. In fact, I'd be happy to send you something free for parents, chunks of the old Rosner program that's now public domain, that they can do with them at home to try to help them tune their ear to the sounds.
Fantastic, thank you. One other question here from a parent: do you see value? I'm not quite. I've got to rephrase the question because it's coming from somebody else. But what is the purpose of onset and rhyme teaching?
It's just a little step. It's just a little transition from syllable to dealing with individual phonemes, because the easiest phoneme for when you're going to break apart the syllable, the easiest phoneme to access is that very first phoneme, and that's really what we're talking about onset rhyme. It's just a step. Technically, what you call onset, all that awareness, first sound awareness, it is phoneme awareness. It's just dramatically easier than dealing with middle sounds and ending sounds independently. So, you know, some people don't even like making that distinction, and they'll say, no, let's just talk about first sound awareness. Same concept, different name.
What's going on in my head as a result of our chat today, David, is I'm pulling everything together that you've been saying about the awareness, the activation, and also those steps. And so for me now, my head is in relation to that question got quite a different, or a much more informed perspective around onset and rhyme. And that's something I can elaborate on later. Right, one very last question, and that is from a parent who is having significant challenges helping their child to blend through sound and then go back and form a spoken word. What would you recommend for them?
Yeah, I think doing sort of a gradual type of thing, using maybe blocks or something else, or even letters, you know, you could. But really just getting, and even saying them, saying things, you know, very slowly and separately, and going slowly between them, rather than a separate, you know, doing cat, okay? And so shortening it up. how close together do they need to be for that child to get it? That's what you want to know. And then you pull it apart a little at a time, very gradually. So I think being very explicit and giving multiple opportunities for that type of blending. For most children who end up struggling, the blending is developed earlier than being able to do the analysis and pull words apart.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. On behalf of everybody here in New Zealand, David, I would like to thank you so much for giving up your time to speak with us in what is our this morning. What is the time for you?
It's 4:32 in the afternoon.
So I'd just like to thank you so much. We will connect via email. I would really love to be able to share that free resource that you mentioned out to parents. I would like to ask you, please, to choose a number between 1 and 29.
24.
24. So we have a whole lot of comments in our thread, and that person who has number 24, which I will work out shortly, is going to be sent a copy, and it may be another copy that they can then pay it forward to give to somebody else too, of your book, which we stock, Equipped for Reading Success. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in with us. We hope that you have really enjoyed this morning's chit chat. Again, it's been an absolute privilege to connect with you, David, and I wish everybody well. Take care.
Thanks.